I'm a retailer. I probably want to look at my item catalog and make a hard decision. If I surface an item with too low of a price, but then has too many tariffs, not only may you scare off demand, but you may end up with a perception about your products that they're just too expensive.
All right, friends, today's guest is someone who's lived every side of the e-commerce logistics game. He was at FedEx, led strategy at Pitney Bowes, helped Octane's integrations at Ship Engine, and now Krish is the VP of Global Partnerships at Easyship, where he's helping brands scale internationally. He's actually a second-time guest on the podcast. For those of you who have not listened to the first episode, I would highly recommend it, and we will link it in our show notes. So Krish, so happy to have you back on the podcast.
Great to be here. Always a fun time.
Bro, welcome back, man.
Krish and I always look forward to your classic dad joke moment. So let's kick off with that.
I love it. For anybody who knows me well, I have a 17-year-old that I drive around and I tell dad jokes to her friends in the car. For some reason, I'm not allowed to drive them anymore. I don't know why. But for anybody listening, Ninaad, Harshida, myself, we're all of Indian origin. My joke is this. Why do Indian South Asians always have hypertension? Because you can't spell cholesterol without the chole.
You got to spell the whole chole. Dude.
I feel like my kids need to learn how to spell and understand a bunch of things before they will get that one. But I'm going to keep it in my back pocket because I think they will appreciate that one.
Yeah.
I think that's like dad jokes. Maybe we got to get them to like 8,
advanced
10,
level.
12
It's
years
not beginner
old,
friendly.
Yeah, exactly.
There's always time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I love it. Well, thank you so much again, Krish. Let's kick off the podcast by having you share a little bit of advice for brands that are trying to navigate and manage the cross-border chaos that's happening right now. What kind of advice and how do you ground folks in today's day and age, especially with the turmoil over the last few months?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, with all of the going global chat, we've trained people on utilizing all of these benefits that they have or being able to do 1, 2, 3 and how people were utilizing de minimis coming inbound, but also utilizing outbound and tariff changes and whatnot. How does peak season look like, bro?
Sure. I think we're all figuring it out at the same time, whether it's carriers, other providers, retailers, or shippers. We're all in the same boat together. I think all of us are trying to do the right thing, but it is hard to figure out how things are going to change from one day to the next. I think right now, while you have customs authorities trying to navigate these and crack down a little bit, if you're a shipper or a retailer doing the right thing, meaning you're trying to find the country of origin for a shipment, which is now a new requirement on postal shipments, or you're trying to fill out a commercial invoice as best as you can. You're trying to do the right things. While I can't officially say that effort is going to be rewarded, what I will say is that since we're all navigating that together, the retailers who are taking it seriously and really are trying to make that good faith effort are the ones that are going to succeed. They're trying to adapt to new normals, new narratives, and trying to get a hold of it first rather than just giving up their hands or throwing up their hands. And there will also be a lot of opportunity for people who are willing to adapt and get used to these things.
Yeah, I think with the changes taking effect, we think about that growth of globalization, people shopping. Do you see impacts coming in from like the engagement towards American brands? Is there an impact being felt by brands right now on the overall volumes, etc.?
Sure. I think that there's a hesitation for sure. So I think when we talk about where that hesitation's arising, global trade had moved toward a lower and lower threshold of item sale or GMV of an item being sold in e-commerce, and that threshold of somebody saying, sure, internationally, I'm willing to buy it from a retailer on both sides of the pond. I think with the de minimis change, what we're seeing is that threshold has shot up. If you're looking at a high ticket, high priced item, you might be willing to pay that de minimis or extra tariffs because you're not as price sensitive. You're talking about something that maybe $300, $400, $500. If you have a demand, you're wanting it now. I think where we're really seeing a change is in things that are under $100 in value or under $200 in value, not just from the standpoint of the tariffs causing an increased price, but the lack of visibility that sometimes either retailers or even carriers have on where is my package. Now there's that hesitation of, is it just due to the fact that it's international and it's coming in, or the fact that a customs authority may be seizing it, and do I have the visibility into that? More importantly, what do I do about it if there's a problem? That's still very much a question for retailers, carriers, and the end consumer.
Yeah, I think one of the things that is tricky about the timing of this, Krish, is we are just around the corner to peak season. Yep. This is make or break for a lot of brands, and it's very meaningful to everybody. Would love any perspective or advice you might want to give, especially when it comes to cross-border, because a lot of logistics experts have had to rewrite their playbooks this year. We just kind of have to go with the flow. What would be your advice or perspective on prepping for peak season in the best way we possibly can?
For sure. I think a couple things. If I'm a retailer, I probably want to look at my item catalog and make a hard decision. Maybe it's based on demand, maybe it's based on item price, as to what I'm going to surface to the international consumer. Because number one, if I surface an item with too low of a price, but then has too many tariffs, not only may you scare off demand, but you may end up with a perception about your products that they're just too expensive. So I think that's one thing. I think the second point is, what are my returns policies going to be? Because for years, people wanting to skirt duty and tax issues would do one of two things. They would either say, okay, this is a gift shipment, because typically gift shipments are not subject to duties and taxes, or they would say it's a return. Well, in this case, we're talking about a retailer who legitimately may have a consumer with a return. So the question becomes, what are my return costs? What are my processing costs? How badly do I need that item back in my inventory for resale? And what's going to be my brand experience if I have a keep it philosophy? We all know retailers who do sugar returns say, all right, keep it. It's too much for us to process. We see some big box retailers who do that, but typically it's because the item price is lower. Now we have to talk about what that's going to mean if an item has a higher price because it's an international order. We also know that naturally there are Reddit forums of people who want to game the system on it. The idea is that's a really hard decision to make, not just from the standpoint of the cost, but even a brand side of it. And what I mean by that is there are sometimes retailers who, even with the high cost, will say, no, I want it back, either because they want the inventory, or they want to cut down on fraud, or because from the standpoint of my brand's at a premium, if someone keeps it, then does that cheapen my product or the perception about it? So I think these are all questions that retailers, when they're shipping internationally, really have to start asking themselves in a different way than they did before. And I think item sale price probably is the first barometer or barrier that those retailers are going to use in making that judgment.
But wouldn't you say, right, like in the current environment, it's better to find a secondary market in those local markets than to try and, regardless of value, is better due to paperwork complexities? It's a step solution for the time being while things settle down. If I was to bring something back, even at high value, how much paperwork and impact am I going to end up having on something of that nature? Are solution providers, the company you work for, or others that have fully loaded pricing available on the outbound side. Is it just as easy right now to do the calculation and guarantees of what it's going to cost to get something back? Or are we in a flux environment that it's better to just say, no, let's just deal with it?
It's a tough question. I don't think there's a perfect answer to that. One thing I have to caution for anybody thinking, could I find somebody in market for liquidation? The challenge becomes a complicated finance or treasury question. If somebody's going from the US to the UK or the EU and wants to liquidate that item, you essentially have 3, 4, 5 different transactions. You have the US consumer to the one in the EU. You have then EU as almost a cashless transfer to that liquidator, and the liquidator back to the original retailer. So you have a lot of different treasury questions that make it, frankly, kind of scary. We're already talking about an environment where we're scared because of complexity and potentially getting dinged on costs. What about later on if somebody says, oh, wait, this was a whole issue with your finance, your different sides of the ledger. So it is, unfortunately, a good bit more complicated than even saying find somebody in market who could buy it. A lot
in market, yeah. Maybe let's flip this around also on we spoke about returns, we spoke about cross-border, right? Like cross-border returns. Where's your head at as far as the carriers are concerned going into peak season, Chris, right? We saw some pricing drop, some changes that are being impacted. Maybe you want to catch the audience up a little on the changes we are seeing from that perspective and peak season readiness.
So I think we're seeing a few changes. Just like the idea of death and taxes, we have seen carrier rate change, and they typically seem to happen earlier and earlier. We all know that we see the typical 5.9%, things like that. But when you really dive in the details, it's not really 5.9%. That may be on one lane, one weight of shipment, but certain things like oversized fees go up 20, 30, 40, 50% sometimes year over year, depending on the carrier. I think the things that are really catching my attention this year are, no doubt we see different fee surcharges, particularly on oversize and larger weight items changing. With all of the changes with de minimis, we're seeing carriers, a major one announced a $2.50 one Oz just to process an international order. Forget about the fees and surcharges associated with duties, taxes, and the high cost of an international shipment. We're sticking on another $2.50 on top of that just to process the fact that it's crossing a border. The second is obviously peak season surcharge. Many carriers have done that for years. That's not unusual, but we're seeing that more than usual this year and starting a little earlier. The third one is one of the major carriers had a change to how they calculate dimensional weight. Dimensional weight is the idea that it doesn't necessarily matter what your box weighs. It's about the volume weight that it takes.
Precise, yeah.
And now we're seeing even if it's 0.001, that it could be rounded up to the next pound. That's a point that us as shippers are all going to have to contend with.
Yeah. And all of these things add up, especially as you're thinking about peak season. I genuinely feel concerned for the smaller brands that have already had so much to contend with for this year, having these additional charges and things in flux. I don't think it's going to do them any favors. I would love your perspective on where you think AI is potentially going to help with removing or reducing any friction. Have you seen anything that you find interesting in this space, especially when it comes to AI and application of AI?
For sure. I think it's interesting because a couple of years ago, all of us were talking about blockchain. Then we were talking about 5G. Now we're talking about AI. What's interesting is there's a world where all of this lives, all of this technology innovation. One area that's fascinating to me is in the warehouse. So in addition to talking about AI and robots, I pray to God that nobody had a Terminator-style robot in a warehouse. Jokes aside, things like 5G. A couple years ago, I was asked about that. I said that in the warehouse, things like 5G can make things cleaner, crisper, faster, especially when we talk about the idea of subscription boxes or boxes with multiple items from around the warehouse. Same thing with AI. Can they make things like the pick process more efficient and cleaner, especially when there are multiple steps involved?
I definitely think so. Like, I think that's where inside the warehousing, decision making, logic around realities, right? So machine learning's always been around and optimizing things, so that nothing's new about that. Like, that aspect has always been there. But the ability to truly infer information in a very different way, like that's what LLMs kind of bring to the table, to say, rather than a supervisor, manager, general manager reading a report and actually making a decision, can this tooling actually look at the data, look at its output in a real human sense and go, okay, based on all of these 5 things, what's the logical next thing that I need to do? The nuances of machine learning and the effort that it takes to develop something of that nature versus what you can do now, I think there is a wild difference, right? And I think there is going to be a huge impact because of that. But I also feel like something as simple as like carrier decision making, the way we have been doing carrier decision making inside the warehouse, that has always been this logical step flow of like, if this, then that, if not this, then that, right? There has been really cool tech that takes into consideration other aspects like your spend and doing more predictive validation of, just because it's cheaper to make this decision right now, is it really good for me from a GRI standpoint or the total spend contractual commitments that I have against contractors? Now, all of that's available within the softwares that are out there today. I think where it gets interesting is the decision making being more rapidly evolving in real time, looking at GRI, but also looking at my warehouse volume to actually inform, well, maybe my operational impact right now of choosing this carrier is going to be much higher from how much volume I need to ship down a given lane. I should be looking at GRI, but I should switch it around for a few hours so that I can get my operations moving to meet the customer commitments. There is this nuanced aspect that goes into it as well. A lot of the paperwork, like the international shipping, identification of product, the HS code validations, all of that, I think it starts becoming easier and easier and easier and more accessible. Not that we have not had like computer vision technology that could recognize the product. One of the companies I used to work for 10 plus years ago, we used to have ML models that would do HS classification. I think it's going to get better and more democratized and accessible to brands that could not access capabilities like that. A dramatic change is bound to happen.
For sure. I think a couple things to riff from that point. When it comes to HS classification, historically, auto classification APIs, meaning you just put in the item description and it comes, gives you an HTS code, and then you get the duty and tax value, were horribly imprecise, not really because of the fault of the API itself, but because you can't fix intent of what somebody had in mind of why they're selling an item, what it's being used for, things like that. Whereas now with AI, we're seeing a much better, more accurate way of looking at it because AI can help with learning, number one, and intent, or at least learning that intent. So definitely we're seeing the auto classification APIs get better. Certainly a lot of improvement there, though it'll never be perfect because I don't think an AI tool can truly grasp human intent, at least not today, at least not until the Terminator bots come.
They're coming. I think we're just around the corner, man.
One other thing I think it's important to bring up if we're talking about the idea of carriers and AI is a little more of that agentic AI shopping. I still think we're in the infancy, but we're starting to see that on one hand, you have people who will do Google searches, but sometimes the information you need is now too many sponsored ads. Whereas if you go into an agentic AI search and give more data and granularity around what you're shopping for, the intent, what it's being used for, you can get some pretty good answers. And we're still in the infancy, I think, a little bit on the idea of agentic AI and search and purchase decisions. But I do think it'll be interesting to see, maybe if we do this next year at this time, how much agentic AI will be used in carrier selection process, to your point about what we're using carriers for and why and when.
I wholeheartedly agree, bro. It gets me geeked out about that subject. Also kind of scares me because the amount of disruption, some of the cookie-based personalization that drove in the industry before it all got clamped down with Meta, Facebook, and be able to do target marketing and understand you. But at the end of the day, it was still putting you in a Meta group, right? It didn't understand Chris as the dad of kids that this age works in the logistics space, and that's kind of your profile. Well, AI is personal with its memories and its understanding of Ninaad and who Ninaad happens to be. And it's like, ask a question to ChatGPT about what do you know, and be brutally honest. I know that's a thing that goes around, and you will find out how much it knows. And when it knows that much, their ability to provide that intent and information in conjunction with shopping, right? I don't know what that looks like. We had a really good conversation with the CTPO of ThreadUp, and they were having a conversation around how agentic shopping and the flow around agentic shopping is going to change the universe. It's more like maybe it starts with, this is my budget, this is what I want to do, go ahead and do it. Because right now I'm in that state of do I really, think about the early 2000s when e-commerce was the question of, do I really want to give my credit card online? I'm in the same state right now using agentic models of saying, hey, go find me tickets for this, but I don't want you to go buy, go find me the tickets and it comes back with the result. I got this date coming up, or I got this thing coming up and I need this for that, go find it. And it knows this personalization. As we get comfortable, we will allow opening up our credit cards. The end state is, when does a person allow and find that confidence to give the credit card because the result is enriched? Like in e-commerce, the result was enriched, what you ended up getting. I think that's the exact same thing that's about to happen in this space. Is it next year? Is it a year from now? The fact of the matter is, what we see as AI today, it's going to go through at least 50 other iterations before we would say this is normalized. And for us, I see that future where it knows what I need, it knows my intent, and it does shopping for me. Because it's so important to Ninaad, I'm just going to make this decision to buy or pay the extra duties. When that intent is passed back to the logistics provider, they can also execute upon that intent. I see a really cool tech side of this equation, but a scary human side of this equation of what actually ends up going down. So the capitalism running amok.
Yeah,
So,
I think the key takeaway that I'm getting from all of this is that Harsha needs to use your phone and search for things, especially with ChatGPT, so that it tricks the agentic AI systems and it forces you to buy it so that you think it's your idea. I'm with you.
I like where this is going,
Exactly.
Krish. Maybe I'll switch topics a little bit. One of the things I've always appreciated about you is when you talk about logistics, you don't just talk about it as a set of systems. You always frame it through relationships, policy, and people. Today, there's so many difficult conversations and situations that various brands are dealing with. Would love your thoughts on bundled logistics and how you think about it.
Sure, absolutely. I think idea of bundled logistics is, in my mind, how do the network of technology, carriers, warehouses, and other providers talk to each other? How do they play nicely in the sandbox? And that's going to become more important than ever before, especially with all the changes, talking about with international. I think one thing that I'm going to be looking at is, especially on international, we're talking about how if you want to do a return, for example, it's going to be really important to show the original outbound transaction. Yes, this was made. Here's the commercial invoice associated. The outbound is a more premium method because that's associated with my brand. Whereas a return, I'm trying to save money. So I may use a different carrier. Maybe the visibility isn't as good, but I don't really care as much because I'm going to get it back, put it in inventory. But when we talk about bundled logistics, especially on international, how important will it be to link those two transactions? If you have a return management system, you have an RMA system. And when you're talking about using different carriers, that can be very awkward when you're talking about the outbound transaction, the commercial invoice, and then trying to link that with a return. That's going to be tough. Carriers can make it easy on both sides and communicate where there are cost savings is going to be hugely important from the idea of bundled logistics. The second is I always talk about the idea of returns. How do you dismantle an atomic bomb? Don't build one to begin with. It's the same idea on returns. How do we prevent returns? You never prevent them entirely. And maybe you don't want to, by the way. When you have better product descriptions, clearer guidelines on your website, better lighting, better wording, maybe even the use of AI to do those things, then you really can reduce and cut down returns because you've created a better customer experience. So that actually becomes hard to measure, but the reality is you can really cut down the number of returns you have by doing some things proactively on the outbound. I think a couple of those areas there are definitely areas I'm going to be watching on bundled return or bundled logistics. The last area I'll say is rates in the cart themselves. I've always talked about rates and delivery in the cart. Certainly a lot of great companies out there, Shipper HQ, other ones out there who do a really good job of that. The idea there is with rates and delivery in the cart, especially if we're talking about the granularity and nuance with international, how important is that going to be? So I think that's really something bundle logistics we're going to see more and more of.
Just like on that one point, and I've been harping about this since the start. The fact that we in 2025, right? That's the year. Yes, it's 2025. We are still talking about this promise engine of like rates and delivery and commitment in cart. How is it that we are still not there yet? That should be absolute table stake for anyone that does any meaningful volume. If you ship more than 100 units a day, you should have the technology capable of actually making a commitment as to when the shipping is going to happen. And I'm not saying 2 days, right? Like that's not what I'm promising, but at least make a promise and calculate the rate, be able to actually do that by making a carrier commitment up top. How is it in 2025 that we still aren't there while we talk about all of this cool other tech that's going on?
It's an interesting question because if you talk to people outside our industry, the idea is, well, why is it that hard? A carrier says 2 days, 3 days, 5 days. Why is it so hard? And the reality is few people understand the nuance that goes with it, with carrier policies, the information they give you and pass back, different services having different days and cutoffs is a very granular concept, and few people have gotten it right.
I think those few people need to be available to pretty much everyone and make it easier, because if I don't see a commitment, I'm like, well, and again, that's more philosophical.
Yeah, it's an extension of your brand name, but it also goes to item price. I'm used to Amazon Prime and the idea of ordering something. Do I really look and see, did it make it by Wednesday or did it come by Thursday? I probably don't pay that close of attention. That may be because of the selling price or need of the item. Whereas if I'm buying something from one of my favorite retailers, I'm tracking that and refreshing the screen, and I'm looking at that in cart, certainly because it's something that was a bit more of a luxury item or something I really want and then paid a bit more for. So I think it is very much a relationship to item price, and with increased prices, with tariffs and things like that, it's going to become more important, even if it's not an international order.
Very true.
Makes sense.
Krish, you recently wrote the 2025 Ecom Outlook. Lots of great points that you covered there, but would love to have you share with our audience one prediction or something that you want to make sure that leaders are keeping in mind as we head into the peak season, perhaps something they are underestimating. For the audience, if you have not read this piece, we will include it in the show notes so you can easily access it.
One piece of advice, I always go back to returns as a topic. My unhealthy obsession with returns. During COVID, we saw people have a return window going very far into the future, and they pulled that back after the pandemic. The question remains, what's the balance between getting it right for the consumer and giving them an appropriate enough window, and also making sure that you have the item back in your inventory so you can resell and reduce inventory costs or inventory turns. So I think really the question is, when does holiday return window start for you? Meaning, does it start as soon as October and extend into March? And then what are you going to do about it from your returns policies? And how are you communicating that to people on your website?
Absolutely. Krish, this has been an amazing conversation. Thank you for bringing all this clarity and perspective for the year that has felt like nothing but chaos. Before we wrap, what would be the best way for our listeners to keep up with you on socials, and how can they get in touch with you?
For sure. Always the best way is to find me on LinkedIn. And if you send me a connection request, please let me know that you are not trying to sell me a franchise business, and then I'll accept the invite.
Krish also publishes some really great insights on LinkedIn, so definitely someone that I would recommend following. And for all of our listeners, thank you so much for spending time with us today. If this episode sparks something new in your mind, or something that someone else might be wrestling with, please share it with them. Follow us on LinkedIn and check out all the show notes. We really appreciate you tuning in, and we'll see you next time.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Always great.